The stench of antiseptic and fear clung to the air, a perfume she'd never forget. One moment, Nurse Clara Hayes was ending a grueling 16-hour shift at St. Jude's Mercy Hospital. The next, she was in the back of a black sedan, a silk blindfold over her eyes and cold terror in her veins. Her patient wasn't in a sterile ER. He was a ghost, a myth, a man whose name was only whispered in the darkest corners of the city. Now he was bleeding on his own $1,000 rug, a bullet wound gaping in his side. She did her job, her hands steady, while her world shattered. And when she was done, he gave her a new set of instructions, his voice a low gravel that promised no escape. Lock the door, and don't leave. The rain over Viridia City was relentless, a percussive drumming against the windows of the ER that mirrored the frantic beat of Clara Hayes's own heart. 16 hours. She'd been on her feet for 16 hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the grim satisfaction of saving a life. All she wanted was her small apartment, a hot shower, and 12 hours of dreamless sleep. As she pushed through the double doors into the damp night air, pulling her worn coat tighter, the exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She fumbled for her keys, her mind already on the pillow she so desperately craved. That's why she didn't notice the black sedan idling silently at the curb, its tinted windows like obsidian mirrors reflecting the neon-slicked street. She was 2 steps from her car when 2 figures materialized from the shadows. They moved with a predatory silence that was utterly alien to the controlled chaos of the hospital. Before she could scream, a large, leather-gloved hand covered her mouth, and a strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. A voice calm and devoid of emotion whispered in her ear. "No noise, nurse. We just need your expertise." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This wasn't a mugging. They knew who she was. The back door of the sedan opened, and she was bundled inside. A silk blindfold was tied expertly over her eyes, plunging her into a world of muffled sounds and the scent of expensive leather, and something else. Gunpowder. The drive was terrifyingly smooth, the car gliding through the city streets with an unnerving confidence. No one spoke. The silence was a heavy blanket, suffocating her with 1,000 unspoken threats. She tried to track their movements, a right turn, a long straightaway, the rumble of crossing a bridge, but she was disoriented and trembling. They were climbing the engine, whining as they ascended what felt like a spiral ramp, a parking garage. She was led from the car, a firm hand on her elbow, guiding her into an elevator. The scent of ozone and steel filled the small space. It ascended for what felt like an eternity, a smooth, silent ride that ended with a soft chime. When the doors opened, the air changed. It was warm, dry, and carried the faint scent of Cuban cigars and aged whiskey. They walked her down a hallway, carpeted so thick her footsteps made no sound. A door opened. She was pushed gently inside, and the door clicked shut behind her, with the heavy finality of a vault. "You can take off the blindfold now," a new voice commanded. It was different from the men in the car. This one was low, rough-edged with pain, but it held an unmistakable core of absolute authority. Clara's fingers trembled as she fumbled with the knot. The silk fell away, and her eyes struggled to adjust to the light. She was standing in the most opulent room she had ever seen. It was a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing a panoramic God's-eye view of Viridia City's glittering skyline. Cream-colored leather sofas, A grand piano in the corner, abstract art on the walls. It was a palace in the sky. But the luxury was tainted by the scene in the center of the room. A man was slumped in a large armchair, his face pale and beaded with sweat under the warm track lighting. He was handsome in a brutal, angular way, with sharp cheekbones, dark hair slicked back, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray, but the jacket was open, and the white shirt beneath was soaked in a horrifyingly large patch of crimson. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat on the table beside him, next to a menacing-looking black pistol. An older, silver-haired man in an impeccable suit stood beside him, his face a mask of worried professionalism. He gestured to a large, open metal case on the floor. It was filled with professional-grade medical supplies, gauze, antiseptic sutures, surgical tools, a makeshift operating theater. "He's been shot." The older man stated his voice flat. The bullet went clean through. "We need you to stop the bleeding and patch him up. We cannot go to a hospital. Discretion is paramount." Clara's training kicked in a blessed autopilot that shoved her terror into a small, manageable box. She knelt, her nurse's eyes assessing the damage. "I need to cut the shirt away. I need boiled water, clean towels, and good light." The wounded man watched her, his gaze intense and unnervingly perceptive. He didn't flinch, didn't groan. He just watched her as if he were trying to dissect her soul. "Lorenzo will get you whatever you need," he rasped, nodding toward the older man. For the next hour, the world shrank to the wound. Lorenzo proved to be a surprisingly competent assistant, his hands steady as he provided supplies. Clara worked with focused precision, cleaning the entry and exit wounds, her mind a whirlwind of anatomy and procedure. The bullet had torn through flesh and muscle in his side, miraculously missing any major organs. It was messy, but it was manageable. As she began the painstaking work of stitching the wound closed, the man finally spoke again, his voice a low murmur. "What's your name, Clara?" "Clara Hayes." "Marco," he said simply. He didn't offer a last name. He didn't need to. In the criminal underworld of Viridia City, there was only one Marco who commanded this level of loyalty and lived in a fortress like this. Marco De Luca. They called him the Ghost, the unseen head of the De Luca crime family. A man who didn't officially exist. She finished the last stitch, her fingers aching. She cleaned the area one last time and applied a thick, sterile dressing, taping it securely. "You need antibiotics, high dosage, and rest. No strenuous activity for at least a week, probably more." "You're lucky. An inch to the left and we wouldn't be having this conversation." He seemed to consider this a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He pushed himself up slightly in the chair, the movement causing a sharp intake of breath, but his expression remained unchanged. He looked at her, then at the sprawling city beyond the glass. Lorenzo Marco said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "See that our guest has everything she needs. A room, food, whatever she wants." Clara's heart seized with a new kind of fear. "Guest, I'm finished. I should go. I won't say anything to anyone, I swear." Marco's gaze snapped back to her, and it was as cold and hard as the barrel of the gun on the table. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. The words he spoke next were not a request. They were a verdict, a sentence passed down from a king in his castle. He gestured to the heavy, reinforced door she'd been brought through. "Lock the door," he told Lorenzo, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "And don't leave." The door clicked shut, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, echoing the finality of a cell door. Clara stood frozen, the medical supplies scattered around her feet. The adrenaline that had carried her through the procedure evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, paralyzing dread. She was a prisoner. Lorenzo Ricci. The man Marco had called his consigliere regarded her with an expression that was not unkind, but held no warmth. It was the look of a man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a calm baritone. "Please do not be alarmed. This is merely a precaution. Marco's enemies are persistent. Your sudden appearance and disappearance would be noticed. For your own safety and for ours, you will remain here until he is well enough to ensure no loose ends can be traced back to this evening." "Loose ends," Clara whispered the words, catching in her throat. "Am I a loose end?" "You are a professional who performed a service," Lorenzo corrected smoothly, though the implied threat hung in the air. "And you will be compensated beyond your wildest dreams for your time and your silence. For now, please think of this as a sabbatical, a very well-appointed one." He led her from the main living area down a corridor lined with more imposing minimalist art to a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. A king-sized bed with an ocean of white linens, an ensuite bathroom of marble and chrome, and a closet filled with women's clothing in various sizes, tags still attached. Silks, cashmeres, designer labels she'd only ever seen in magazines. It was all there, a silent testament to the fact that they had been prepared for any contingency, for any type of woman. The thought was deeply unsettling. The kitchen is fully stocked. Lorenzo continued, his voice a placid tour guide's monotone. There is a library, a gym, a small cinema. You will want for nothing, except of course the ability to leave. Do not try the windows. They are reinforced. Do not try to use any phones or computers for outside contact. The network is closed. We will know. He left her, then closing the door softly behind him. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress so soft it felt like sinking into a cloud. She was trapped in a billionaire's sky prison. She thought of her younger brother Leo, a brilliant art student she was putting through Viridia University. She was his only family. He would worry. He'd call the police. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. What would people like Marco De Luca do to a nosy college kid, asking questions? The first few days passed in a blur of surreal luxury and suffocating anxiety. She explored the penthouse, a ghost in her own gilded cage. She found the library filled with first editions and leather-bound classics. She found the gym, a state-of-the-art facility she had no desire to use. She ate gourmet meals she prepared herself from a refrigerator that was perpetually magically restocked by silent, unseen hands when she slept. She saw Marco only intermittently. He remained in the main living area, conducting business with a revolving door of hard-faced men who never looked her in the eye. His voice was a constant low rumble from the other room. Calm, decisive commands that brokered deals and settled disputes with a chilling finality. He was a king holding court, his throne a blood-stained armchair. Her job was to change his dressing twice a day. These brief encounters were the most terrifying moments of her day. She would approach him with her sterile kit, her heart pounding. He would fall silent, dismissing his men with a flick of his wrist. Then he would simply watch her as she worked, his dark eyes following her every move. He never spoke, never flinched as she cleaned the healing wound. The intimacy of the act was unnerving. Her hands dedicated to healing were touching this man, whose life was built on violence and death. On the fourth day, as she was securing the new bandage, her hand brushed against his uninjured side. His skin was warm, and she felt the hard muscle tense beneath her fingers. She pulled back as if burned. For the first time since that first night, he spoke to her directly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You have steady hands," he observed. "You're not afraid." It was so far from the truth that a humorless laugh almost escaped her. "I'm terrified," she said, her voice barely a whisper, refusing to meet his eyes. "But my hands know what to do. It's muscle memory." "Muscle memory," he repeated, testing the words. "You find comfort in procedure, in order." "It's my job," she said, packing up her supplies, desperate to retreat to the safety of her room. "Is that all it is?" "A job," he pressed. "You seemed different when you were working. Focused. You didn't see me or this room. You just saw the problem." She risked a glance at him. He was looking at her with genuine curiosity, the mask of the ruthless Mafia boss slipping for just a fraction of a second. Seeing the room would have been a distraction. Seeing you would have been a bigger one. "I saw a patient who needed help." He nodded slowly, a strange, almost wistful expression on his face. "A patient. No one has called me that in a long time." Before she could process the bizarre turn in conversation, Lorenzo entered the room, his face grim. He leaned down and whispered something in Marco's ear. The curiosity vanished from Marco's face, replaced instantly by a cold, dangerous fury. The shift was so sudden, so total, it was like watching a mask drop into place. Dmitry Ivanov Marco snarled the name, tasting like poison. "That son of a bitch is getting bold. He thinks because I'm off the board for a week, he can move on my territory, on the docks." He looked at Lorenzo. "Call a meeting. I want everyone here. And get me eyes on every move the Ivanov Bratva makes. I want to know when Dmitri takes a piss." He stood up, a wince of pain, the only sign of his injury. The patient was gone. In his place stood Marco De Luca. The ghost and the air in the room crackled with the promise of violence. Clara backed away slowly, retreating to her room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just seen the real Marco De Luca, and she understood with chilling certainty that the man she was patching up was capable of tearing the entire city apart. The penthouse, once a silent, gilded prison, transformed into a war room. The hushed, respectful tones of Marco's underlings were replaced by tense, strategic arguments. Maps of Viridia City were spread across a massive mahogany table. Names were mentioned, names of shipping companies, union leaders, and rival capos. It was a world Clara could barely comprehend, a complex ecosystem of power and violence operating just beneath the surface of her own. She remained in her designated areas, a phantom presence, changing Marco's dressing with clinical detachment, while the fate of the city's underworld was decided a few feet away. Marco ignored her, his focus entirely on the threat posed by Dmitry Ivanov and the Russian Bratva. He was a general commanding his troops, his injury a mere inconvenience. But the body has its own set of rules, and it does not respect the authority of a crime boss. Late one night, nearly a week into her captivity, Clara was awoken by a muffled crash from the living room. Her heart leapt into her throat. She sat up in bed, listening, every nerve on high alert. Was it an attack? Were Ivanov's men here? Silence. Hesitantly, she slipped out of bed and crept to her door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. Nothing. Driven by a mix of fear and her ingrained nursing instincts, she slowly opened the door and peered out. The living area was lit only by the ambient glow of the city lights outside. And there on the floor was Marco. He was on his hands and knees, his body trembling with effort. The glass that had been on the table beside his chair lay shattered on the floor. He had tried to stand perhaps to get a drink, and his body had betrayed him. For a moment, she saw not the terrifying mob boss, but a man humbled by pain and weakness. Without thinking, she rushed to his side. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "You'll tear the stitches." He looked up at her, his face a mask of sweat and frustration. Humiliation warred with pain in his eyes. "Leave me," he growled, the command lacking its usual force. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice firm, as she knelt beside him. "And you're my patient. You're also a fool for trying to get up on your own. Let me help you." He glared at her, but the fight seemed to drain out of him. He was breathing heavily, a low groan escaping his lips as he slumped back against the leg of the chair. "Damn it. Here." She put a hand on his arm. "Lean on me. We'll get you back in the chair." Together with her supporting his weight and him using the chair for leverage, they managed to get him settled back into the cushions. He leaned his head back, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. The exertion had opened a small part of the wound. A fresh spot of red was blooming on the white bandage. "I'll have to check the dressing," she said. Softly. She fetched her kit and some water. As she cleaned and redressed the weeping wound, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't tense or threatening. It was vulnerable. Why, he asked, his voice quiet, his eyes still closed. "Why what? Why do you do it?" "Your job. Tending to people. Even people like me." Clara paused, carefully taping the new bandage in place. "When I was 15, my little brother Leo fell from a treehouse, broke his arm in 3 places. He was screaming and I was useless. I was so scared. The nurse in the ER, her name was Mrs. Gable. She was so calm. She talked to him, made him laugh, even while they were setting the bone. She took control of the chaos. She made everything okay. I decided right then that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the person who could step into the chaos and make things okay." She finished her work and began packing her supplies. She expected him to say nothing, to retreat back into his intimidating silence. Instead, he spoke, his voice a low, rumbling confession to the city lights. "When I was 15, he began, his voice raspy. I watched my father and my older brother get gunned down in our own restaurant. Rival family. The Gallo crew. They thought they could take over our territory by cutting off the head." He opened his eyes and they were filled with a haunted darkness that seemed ancient. "I hid in the pantry behind sacks of flour. I didn't make a sound. I wasn't calm. I didn't make anything okay. I just watched. I learned." Clara sank into the sofa opposite him, her professional distance completely shattered. She was looking at the boy who had hidden in the pantry, the trauma that had forged the monster. "What did you learn?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That chaos doesn't need to be controlled," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "It needs to be aimed. You use your skills to mend. I use mine to ensure that what happened to my family never happens to me. We both manage damage, Clara. We just do it on different ends of the spectrum. The chasm between them had for a moment been bridged by a shared, fragile humanity. She saw the man, and he, she suspected, saw more than just a nurse. The air grew thick with an unspoken understanding, a dangerous current of electricity that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a burgeoning, terrifying connection. The moment was broken by the quiet chime of the elevator. Lorenzo entered, his face etched with concern, taking in the scene, the shattered glass, the fresh bandage, the intense proximity of his boss and the nurse. "Everything all right, Marco?" he asked, his eyes flicking to Clara. Marco didn't break his gaze from hers. "Everything is under control, Lorenzo." But Clara knew it wasn't true. For the first time since she'd been brought to this place, nothing felt under control at all. She was no longer just his nurse, and he was no longer just her captor. Something new, something far more complicated and perilous, had begun to grow in the silence of the penthouse high above the sleeping city. The shared vulnerability of that night altered the atmosphere in the penthouse. The line between captor and captive blurred, replaced by a delicate, unspoken truce. Marco began to speak to her more, not with commands, but with questions. He asked about her studies, about the grueling life of a nurse, about her brother Leo's art. He listened with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. In return, he offered her small, fragmented glimpses into his own life. He never spoke of his illicit business, but he talked about his mother's cooking, about the way Viridia City looked from this vantage point during a thunderstorm, about his appreciation for opera. He was unwrapping the layers of the ghost, revealing the man Marco beneath, and Clara, against all reason, found herself captivated. She knew it was dangerous. It was Stockholm Syndrome, a classic case. But it felt like more. She saw a flicker of the man he might have been had his life not been violently derailed at 15, and a foolish, treacherous part of her heart ached for that man. Her routine became a strange sort of domesticity. She'd make coffee in the morning and bring him a cup. They would sit in silence, watching the sun rise over the city. She organized his library, finding a quiet solace among the ancient stories. He would watch her, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. His men, who were a constant presence, began to treat her differently, with a kind of cautious respect. She wasn't just the help anymore. She was something else. One evening, Marco was in a deep strategic meeting with Lorenzo and two of his top capos, a bulky man named Sergio and a leaner, younger man named Paolo Gallo. The name Gallo pricked at Clara's memory. It was the name Marco had mentioned, the family that had killed his father. She found it strange that a Gallo would be in his inner circle, but she chalked it up to the Byzantine politics of their world, where enemies of one generation became allies of the next. She was in the kitchen preparing a tray of tea when she realized they were out of the specific blend of Earl Grey that Lorenzo preferred. Remembering he'd mentioned a supply closet in the main hall, she slipped out of the kitchen to retrieve it. The closet was near the entrance of the penthouse, tucked away in an alcove. As she searched the shelves, she heard the heavy front door open and close. It was Paolo, likely stepping out to take a private call. She froze, not wanting to be seen eavesdropping. The alcove kept her hidden in shadow. Paolo's voice was a low, urgent whisper, completely different from the respectful tone he used with Marco. "No, not yet. He's still recovering, but he's getting stronger every day." Paolo hissed into the phone. "Ivanov is getting impatient." Clara's blood ran cold. "Ivanov." "Listen to me," Paolo continued, his voice tight with frustration. "He's not as isolated as we thought. He has the nurse here. Yes, a nurse. She hasn't left. It complicates things. And civilian witness." There was a pause. No, I don't think he'll let her go. He watches her. It's different. Another pause longer this time. Paolo's next words made the air leach from Clara's lungs. The attack has to be soon. The security codes for the service elevator change on Friday. That's our window. I'll disable the penthouse lockdown from the inside. But your men will have exactly 3 minutes to get from the elevator to this floor before the secondary alarm triggers and contacts Lorenzo's personal security. 3 minutes. If you can't do it in that time, we're all dead. He ended the call and slipped back into the living room, as if nothing had happened. Clara leaned against the wall in the dark closet, her body trembling uncontrollably. A traitor. There was a snake inside the fortress, and he was about to open the gates to the enemy. The man who had been serving Marco T was plotting to have him killed, and she, the civilian witness, would undoubtedly be killed along with him. Her survival instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to hide, to pray she could somehow make it out alive when the chaos erupted. But then she thought of Marco. She thought of the haunted look in his eyes when he spoke of his father's murder. He had been betrayed by the gallows once before, and now it was happening again, by a man he'd seemingly brought into his fold. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, a new, unfamiliar feeling was rising, a fierce, protective anger. They had pulled her into this world. They had locked her in this cage. But Marco, the monster, the killer, had shown her a sliver of his humanity, and she realized with a terrifying jolt that she wasn't going to let them kill him. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed down her clothes, her hands shaking. She picked up the tin of tea, her mind racing. She had to tell him. She had to find a way to tell him without being overheard by the traitor sitting in the same room. Her life and his depended on her next move. She walked back towards the living room, the tin of tea feeling as heavy as a bomb in her hands. Clara re-entered the living room, her face a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Paolo Gallo glanced up as she entered, giving her a brief, dismissive nod before turning his attention back to the maps on the table. He had no idea she held his life in her hands. She set the tea tray down, her movements deliberately calm and steady. Lorenzo. I found the Earl Grey, she said, her voice sounding surprisingly even. Ah, thank you, my dear, the older man said with a grateful smile. Marco's eyes found hers. He had an uncanny ability to read people, and he must have seen something in her expression, a flicker of fear, a shadow of tension because his gaze sharpened slightly. Clara, are you feeling all right? You look pale, he said, his voice cutting through the men's conversation. Paolo and Sergio stopped talking and looked at her. It was a test. If she panicked, Paolo would know something was wrong. Just a headache, she said, forcing a small smile. The pressure, I think, from the storm rolling in. She glanced out the window where dark clouds were indeed gathering over the city. It was the perfect excuse. If you don't mind, I think I'll get some air on the terrace. The terrace was one place she knew they wouldn't follow her. It was Marco's private sanctuary. Of course, Marco said, his eyes still holding hers, a silent question in them. He gave a subtle nod, an almost imperceptible gesture of permission. Clara slid open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool, damp air. The wind was picking up whipping strands of her hair across her face. The city lights glittered below like a fallen constellation. She walked to the far corner, her back to the window, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. A minute later, The glass door slid open, and Marco stepped out, closing it behind him. He walked over to stand beside her, not speaking, just looking out at the city. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and in the simple white shirt with his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, he looked less like a mob boss and more like an ordinary man. "It's not a headache, is it?" he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. Clara's resolve wavered. Snitches get stitches. In this world they got much worse. But the image of Marco bleeding out on his expensive rug betrayed again, pushed the words out. "It's Paolo," she whispered, not looking at him. "I was in the hall closet. He took a call. He's working with Dmitry Ivanov." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Marco's entire body go rigid. His posture didn't change, but a stillness came over him, the lethal quiet of a predator that has scented its prey. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Her words tumbled out in a frantic, hushed stream. The service elevator. The security codes changing on Friday. The 3-minute window. Paolo disabling the lockdown from the inside. When she finished, the silence stretched between them thick and heavy. Marco remained perfectly still for a long moment, processing the betrayal. The man whose family had murdered his father was planning to finish the job. Finally, he turned his head and looked at her. The fury in his eyes was a terrifying, controlled inferno. But it wasn't directed at her. It was mingled with something else, a raw, grudging respect. "You were scared," he stated. "But you told me anyway. Why?" "Because no one deserves to be stabbed in the back by someone they trust." She said the words coming from a place of pure, unadulterated conviction. "Not even you." A complex emotion played across his face. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a second, before his fingers gently brushed a strand of wind-blown hair from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of. The brief contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. "You chose a side, Clara," he murmured, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "You should know there's no going back from that." "I'm already in this," she replied, her voice shaky but firm. "There hasn't been a way back since the moment I got in that car." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent pact passing between them. He was the monster, the killer, the king of a dark and bloody world. And she, the healer, the ordinary nurse, had just sworn her allegiance. He dropped his hand and turned back to the glass door. The mask was back in place. "Stay here," he ordered, but this time it wasn't the command of a captor. It was the protective order of a man shielding an asset, shielding her. He slid the door open and stepped back into the living room. Clara watched through the glass, her heart pounding. Paolo Marco said, his voice casual, though Clara could now detect the steel beneath it. "My injury is acting up. I need you to run across town and pick up a specific prescription for me from a 24-hour pharmacy on the west side. Lorenzo has the details. It's the only one that works." Paolo, eager to appear loyal, nodded immediately. "Of course, boss. Right away." "Sergio, you go with him," Marco added. "Make sure he doesn't get lost." It was a death sentence delivered with terrifying subtlety. Lorenzo, who had been watching the exchange with a knowing, grim expression, handed Paolo a slip of paper. Paolo and Sergio left their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent apartment. When the elevator chimed, signaling their departure, Marco turned to Lorenzo. "They won't make it past the garage," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Have our people clean it up. No trace." He then looked directly at Clara through the glass. "And get Dmitry Ivanov sam su tu on the su." A phone. Tell him I accept his offer for a truce meeting. Friday. Midnight, at the old shipyard. Tell him to come alone if he wants to prove his sincerity. Lorenzo nodded, his face grim. He won't come alone. I know Marco said, a cruel, predatory smile touching his lips for the first time. He'll bring his best men, and he'll be expecting Paolo to open the door for him. He turned and looked at Clara, who was still standing on the terrace wrapped in the wind. His eyes held a new light, one of possession, of partnership. He had been a patient, then a captor. Now he was something else entirely. He was her protector, and she inexplicably was his confidant. The game had changed, and she was no longer a pawn. She was on the board right next to the king. Friday arrived with the oppressive humidity of the promised storm. A tense electric energy crackled through the penthouse, mirroring the atmosphere outside. Clara felt it in her bones. This was the day of the attack that was no longer a surprise. Marco was a study in controlled lethality. He moved with a newfound purpose, his injury seemingly forgotten. He spent the day with Lorenzo, issuing a quiet, steady stream of commands over encrypted phones. He was not just reacting to Dmitry Ivanov's plan. He was composing a symphony of destruction, and the Russian Bratva was his orchestra. He insisted Clara stay with him in the main living area. "The safest place for you is by my side," he'd stated, leaving no room for argument. So she sat a silent observer on the periphery of the War Council, watching Marco maneuver his invisible pieces across the city. As evening bled into a dark, starless night, Marco's men began to arrive. They were not the usual capos in tailored suits. These were his soldiers, hard-faced men in dark, functional clothing, moving with a quiet professionalism that was far more terrifying than any overt display of aggression. They checked weapons, synchronized watches, and spoke in low, clipped tones. They transformed the luxurious penthouse into a military command center. Marco stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city. He had changed into a simple black long-sleeved shirt and dark trousers, a practical uniform for the night ahead. Clara walked up to stand beside him. Her reflection, a pale, worried ghost next to his dark, solid form. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. "Fear is a luxury," he answered without looking at her. "Tonight is about mathematics, calculating angles, timing, and acceptable losses." Acceptable losses. The phrase chilled her. He finally turned to her, and his eyes were dark and serious. "No one in this room, Clara. That's the only calculation that matters to me." He reached out and tucked a stray piece of her hair behind her ear. "Lorenzo will take you to the safe room when it begins. You will be protected. What about you? I'm the bait," he said with a grim smile. The minutes ticked by, each one a lifetime. Just before midnight, Lorenzo approached them. "He's on his way. Ivanov's convoy just left his headquarters. As planned," Marco said. He looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. "It's time." Lorenzo led her not to her bedroom, but to a section of the library she'd never noticed. He pressed a specific book on a shelf, The Prince by Machiavelli, and a section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing a thick steel door with a digital keypad. "No one gets through this door," Lorenzo assured her, his voice calm. "Stay here until Marco comes for you himself, no matter what you hear." He ushered her inside, and the heavy door swung shut, sealing her in a small, soundproofed room equipped with a simple cot water and a medical kit. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight that was somehow worse than the sounds of battle she was anticipating. All she could do was wait. Outside, Marco gave his final orders. Positions. His men melted into the shadows of the apartment. The lights were dimmed, leaving only the city glow. Marco stood alone in the center of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the perfect picture of an unsuspecting man. At 11:59 p.m., a small light on the security panel by the door blinked green. Paolo's stolen code had worked. The service elevator was now accessible. The 3-minute clock started ticking. Marco took a slow sip of his whiskey. On the security monitor only, he could see he watched as a dozen heavily armed men, clad in black tactical gear, poured out of the service elevator. The Ivanov Bratva. They moved quickly and silently up the emergency stairwell. They were expecting to storm the penthouse. They had no idea they were walking into a perfectly designed kill box. When they breached the hallway leading to the penthouse, Marco's men positioned in adjoining apartments he owned for this very purpose opened fire from both sides. The hallway became a storm of lead and chaos. Inside the penthouse, Marco didn't even flinch. He knew this was just the overture. Dmitri was smarter than that. This was a diversion. As predicted, while the main force was being decimated in the hall, 2 of Ivanov's most elite men rappelled down from the roof, using specialized charges to blow a silent, perfect circle in the reinforced glass of the terrace. They slipped inside, weapons raised, expecting to find a panicked Marco. Instead, they found him waiting, a pistol now in his hand, his expression calm. Before they could react, 2 of Marco's own men dropped from their hiding spots in the rafters of the high ceiling, disarming and neutralizing the intruders with brutal efficiency. And then the front door itself exploded inward. Dmitri Ivanov, a mountain of a man, with a cold, pale face and dead eyes, strode in, flanked by his 2 personal bodyguards. He had used the hallway assault and the terrace breach as a triple-layered distraction. He surveyed the seemingly empty room, his eyes landing on Marco. DeLuca Ivanov boomed his voice, a thick Russian growl. "Your little snake Paolo was very helpful. Pity he had an accident on the way to the pharmacy." "He served his purpose," Marco replied coolly, placing his glass on the table. "So have you," Dmitri snarled, raising his weapon. But before he could fire, the entire penthouse was plunged into absolute darkness. The power had been cut. Marco's final command. In the same instant, the room erupted in a symphony of controlled violence. Muzzle flashes illuminated strobing tableaus of combat. It wasn't a wild firefight. It was a methodical, deadly dance in the dark that Marco and his men had rehearsed 100 times. Inside the safe room, Clara heard nothing. The silence stretched into an eternity. She paced the small space, her mind a canvas for horrific possibilities. After what could have been minutes or hours, the silence was broken by the sound of the keypad. The heavy door swung open. Marco stood there, silhouetted by the dim emergency lights of the hallway. He was covered in dust and grime. There was a fresh cut on his cheek. But he was alive. He was standing. Clara rushed out, her eyes taking in the scene. The penthouse was a wreck. The air was thick with the smell of cordite. Bodies lay shrouded in the shadows. Lorenzo was there, a grim look on his face as he directed the cleanup. She looked at Marco, her heart in her eyes. Dmitri Marco simply looked towards the shattered main window, which now offered an unobstructed, gaping view of the night sky. He didn't need to say anything else. He walked toward her, his expression exhausted but victorious. He stopped directly in front of her, his presence filling her entire world. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that was for her alone. The only calculation that mattered. In that moment, surrounded by the debris of his violent world, Clara didn't see the monster or the mob boss. She saw the man who had weathered the storm, the protector who had kept his promise. And against every law of logic and self-preservation, she leaned into his touch, her allegiance no longer unspoken, but sealed in the silent aftermath of the battle. The dawn that broke over Viridia City was pristine, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gold. The new day offered a brutal contrast to the wreckage within the penthouse. A specialized cleaning crew, as silent and efficient as Marco's soldiers, had worked through the night. The bodies were gone, the shattered glass was being replaced, and the scent of gunpowder was slowly being overpowered by industrial-strength cleaners. The violence had been erased, scrubbed from the surfaces, but Clara knew it would forever be etched into the memory of the walls and into her own soul. She had spent the remainder of the night tending to the wounded, stitching up cuts and bandaging bruises on Marco's men. They accepted her help with a quiet, solemn respect. She was one of them now, an unlikely fixture in their dark firmament. Now she stood on the newly repaired terrace, a mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the city wake up. The past weeks felt like a fever dream. The nurse who had stumbled out of the hospital exhausted and dreaming of her bed was gone. In her place was a woman who had looked into the abyss and hadn't blinked. The glass door slid open and Marco stepped out. He was clean, changed into a fresh shirt. The cut on his cheek was a stark red line, the only visible evidence of the night's battle. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. "The city looks so peaceful from up here," she said quietly. "It's easy to forget everything that happens in the shadows." "The shadows are where the real business is done," he replied, his voice low. "The peace is just an illusion we maintain for the rest of the world." They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sunlight creep across the skyscrapers. The war with the Ivanovs was over. Dmitri's organization had been decapitated overnight. Marco's throne was secure. The immediate danger had passed. "It's over," Clara stated, though it felt like a question. "This battle is," he corrected gently. "There will always be another." He turned to face her, his expression serious, all traces of the warrior gone, replaced by the man who had confessed his deepest trauma to her in the dead of night. "Lorenzo has prepared a package for you," he began, his voice formal. "A new identity. A passport, driver's license, bank accounts with enough money to ensure you and your brother never have to worry about anything for the rest of your lives. A plane is waiting. You can go anywhere in the world. Start over. No one will ever find you. We will ensure it." Clara stared at him, her heart sinking. It was what she should want. Freedom. Safety, a return to normalcy, an escape from this life of violence and fear. "You'll be a loose end, Clara," he continued, his gaze unwavering, brutally honest. "The story I'll tell is that the nurse we hired was killed in the crossfire. You'll have to become a ghost, just like me. You can never contact anyone from your old life again, not even your brother, except through anonymous, untraceable means. Your life as Clara Hayes has to end today." She understood the cold, hard logic. She was a witness. He couldn't just let her walk away. This was his version of mercy, a gilded exile instead of a grave. "And what's the alternative?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. His eyes softened, and he took a step closer, closing the small space between them. He raised a hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "The alternative is that you stay," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur. "You don't go back to your old life. You don't become a ghost. You stay here with me. Not as a prisoner, not as a nurse, as mine." The word was possessive absolute, yet it sounded less like a claim of ownership and more like a plea. "This world is dangerous, and it is ugly. I am a violent man. I can't offer you peace or safety from the world, but I can promise you that you will be the safest person within it. I will be your shield. I will burn down the world to keep you by my side." The choice was laid bare before her. A safe, lonely life of anonymity or a dangerous, precarious life at the center of his dark empire. The sensible, rational part of her, the Clara Hayes who existed just a few weeks ago, screamed to take the plane ticket and run. But as she looked into Marco's eyes, she saw more than a killer. She saw the broken boy in the pantry, the lonely king in his tower, the man who had calculated her survival as his most important variable. He wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her his reality, his protection, his loyalty. He was offering her all of himself. In this violent, chaotic world, she'd been dragged into the only thing that felt real. The only thing that felt like solid ground was him. "My brother," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Leo. He has to be safe. Always." A slow smile spread across Marco's face. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features into something breathtakingly handsome. "Leo's university tuition will be paid for life," he said. "He will have a benefactor who will ensure his art is seen by the right people. He will have a guardian angel he never meets, and he will never want for anything. I swear it on my mother's name." That was all she needed to hear. Clara took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling her lungs, and she made her choice. She stepped forward, closing the final inch between them, and rose on her toes to press her lips against his. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was a seal, a promise, an acceptance. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him as if he were afraid she might still vanish. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his dark eyes searching her face. "Lock the door," she whispered, echoing the words that had once been her sentence, now turning them into a vow. "And don't leave." He understood. He smiled a true and lasting smile and tightened his grip. Never. From the penthouse in the sky, they watched the sun climb higher. Two disparate souls, the healer and the killer, who had found their own twisted, dangerous, and absolute sanctuary in each other's arms, ready to face the shadows of the city together. And so Clara's new life began, not with a quiet closing of a chapter, but with the slam of a vault door, locking her into a world of immense power and constant peril. Her allegiance was no longer to an oath of healing, but to the man who commanded the city's darkness. Theirs is a story born from violence, a romance written in blood, and secrets, proving that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most dangerous of fires. What happens when a healer's compassion is turned toward a man who deals in death? What future can they possibly build in a kingdom of shadows? The story is far from over. If you were captivated by the dangerous dance between Clara and Marco, don't forget to hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with a friend who loves a story where love and danger collide. and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in their thrilling saga. Thank you for listening.